My husband laughed while his son called me a fool in Spanish at my own dinner table. Not loudly. That would have been easier. Just a quiet little sound behind his wine glass. The kind men make when they believe something ugly has landed safely in a room where nobody else can understand it. 4 days after our wedding. 4 days. I remember looking at the candles I had lit myself and thinking very clearly that something inside my life had just closed instead of opened. But I am getting ahead of myself. My name is Arnell Monroe. I am 61 years old, and I have lived in the same house in Birmingham, Alabama for 26 years. I chose every brick of it, paid for every room with money I earned before anyone offered to help me, and long after I stopped waiting for anyone to. I run a procurement consulting firm I built from nothing 22 years ago, after 11 years of doing the same work for somebody else's company and deciding I had learned enough to stop making them rich. I raised my son Orion in that house. I buried my mother from that front porch. I have sat at that kitchen table through things that would have broken a woman who did not know who she was before the trouble arrived. I know who I am, which is why what I am about to tell you is not a story about a woman who lost herself. It is a story about a woman who sat very still and watched other people lose everything they thought they had. Before I get into it, drop your location in the comments. I want to know where you are watching from. This one is for all of us. Now let me take you back to the beginning. For 11 years before I went independent, I managed procurement and supplier relations for a regional construction firm here in Birmingham. A significant portion of the contractor network I built was Hispanic. I learned Spanish the way working people learn most things, out of necessity, out of respect, and over enough years that it stopped feeling like something worth mentioning. It was simply part of how I worked, part of how I listened. I had not thought about it much in years. Hold that detail for me. 18 months before the wedding, I met Royce Holleran at a fundraising dinner I almost did not attend. He was steady, unhurried. He asked questions and listened to the answers, which is rarer than it should be. The courtship moved at the pace I set. He never pushed. I appreciated that. My son Orion was careful about him from the beginning. Not rude. Orion was raised better than that. But there was a watchfulness in him whenever Royce was in the room. A particular stillness that I recognized because I had raised him and I knew what it meant. He never once told me not to marry Royce, but he watched him. Once, about 2 months before the wedding, I came downstairs late one evening and found Royce alone in my living room. No television on, no music, just standing near the hallway, looking at the framed photographs on the wall, and then toward the back of the house where my office sits. When he noticed me, he smiled immediately. Too immediately. I remember asking if he was all right. He said he was just admiring the house. At the time, I believed him. Royce's son, Eldwin. I met twice before the wedding. Both times he was cordial, present. He smiled when he was supposed to smile and said what a gathering like that requires a man to say. But there was something in the way he watched me. Not warmly, not coldly, carefully. I registered it, filed it, did not attach weight to it yet. I married Royce Holleran 4 weeks ago on a Saturday. Small wedding. Flowers I chose myself. A dress the color of warm cream. 12 people seated. Quiet and deliberate. The way I have made every significant decision in my life. I believed in it completely. A woman who has built everything she has from the ground up does not hand belief away carelessly. I gave it deliberately. I have always been careful. It is simply how I am built. I protect what I build. I always have. 4 days later, Royce's son was coming to dinner. His girlfriend would be with him. I spent 4 hours cooking for people who had already decided who they thought I was. And I meant every kind gesture sincerely. I set that table myself. Candles I bought from the shop on Caldwell Avenue, the ones that smelled like cedar and something warm I could never name. My good plates, the cream ones with the gold rim that I had packed away for years and decided that evening were finally worth bringing out. I cooked for 4 hours. I wanted that dinner to feel like a beginning. I believed it was. Royce sat at the head of the table the way he had been sitting in my house since the wedding. Easy, settled, like a man who had already decided the place belonged to him and was simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. I noticed it that evening in a way I had not quite let myself notice it before. I filed it without naming it. Eldwin was polite. Nerissa beside him was quieter than I expected, watchful in a way I recognized, the way a woman is watchful when she is trying to understand the room she has walked into. She was not unfriendly. She was measuring. The conversation moved through safe territory. The food, the neighborhood, a project Royce mentioned at work. Eldwin asked about my firm in the way people ask about things they have already decided are not interesting. The words present, the attention somewhere else. Then Nerissa leaned slightly toward Eldwin. Her voice was low, genuine. She was watching his father laugh at something I had said, and I think the laughter made her think about her own life, her own situation, the man beside her and what she was building with him. She asked him quietly, in English, simply, without agenda, why his father had decided to remarry now. It was a real question. I could hear that it was real. Eldwin answered her in Spanish, casual, unbothered, the cadence of a man speaking a language he is completely certain no one else at the table shares. He did not lower his voice. He did not glance at me. Why did his father remarry? Because she has money. She is a fool. He almost smiled when he said it, not cruelly, which would have been easier to absorb, dismissively. The way you dismiss something that does not require your full contempt because it does not require your full attention. Royce laughed, not loudly, a quiet exhale, a small sound that a stranger might have mistaken for nothing. I did not mistake it for nothing. My husband had heard exactly what his son said in the language they shared across my candle-lit table, in my house, on my good plates, and he had found it amusing, fitting, perhaps, accurate. I set my glass down. My face did not change. I know this because I chose it. I made the choice in the half-second between hearing the words and the next breath I took. I looked at the candle nearest to me, cedar and something warm. I had bought them because I wanted the evening to feel like a beginning. Across the table, Nerissa's eyes moved to my face. Something shifted in hers, not guilt, not sympathy. Something more complicated and more honest than either of those. She looked at me for just a moment, and then she looked away. I excused myself to the kitchen. 30 seconds, maybe less. I stood at the counter with both hands flat on the surface, and I looked at the window above the sink. Dark outside, my own reflection looking back at me. No tears, no anger, something quieter than both. A decision. The morning after the dinner, Royce made coffee the way he always made it. 2 cups, mine with the half-spoon of sugar he had learned I preferred, set on the counter without ceremony. He hummed something low while he rinsed the pot. He moved through my kitchen like a man with nowhere to be and nothing on his conscience. I watched him from the doorway for 3 seconds before I walked in and said good morning. That was the performance. Good morning. Thank you for the coffee. A hand briefly on his arm as I passed. Nothing excessive, nothing cold, just enough to be unremarkable. I had decided in the kitchen the night before that unremarkable was the only thing I was willing to be until I was ready to be something else. I cooked that day. I answered when he spoke. I smiled at the right moments, not warmly enough to invite conversation, not coolly enough to signal anything had shifted. I had spent 22 years managing relationships with people who needed to believe negotiations were going smoothly. This was not different in its mechanics, only in what it cost me. Late that afternoon, Royce walked into the kitchen holding a folder I had never seen before. Blue, folded thin from use. He stopped when he saw me watching him. Then he smiled too quickly and tucked it beneath his arm. Something small. Something most women would miss. But I had spent too many years sitting across tables from men, hiding numbers behind calm faces not to recognize the instinct. I asked him what it was. He said paperwork from an old property issue. Nothing important. Then he changed the subject immediately and asked whether I had ever considered putting the house into a trust. The question came too smoothly, like it had already been waiting for a place to land. I looked at him for 1 second longer than normal before answering. I told him my attorney handled those kinds of decisions for me and asked whether he wanted more coffee. His expression shifted almost invisibly before settling back into place. Then he smiled and said, "Maybe later." I nodded and let the moment pass. But I filed it away beside the folder. I stayed in the house deliberately. I want to be clear about that. Leaving before anything was in place would have helped no one, least of all me. I knew enough about how these things move to know that stillness, held correctly, is its own kind of leverage. So I stayed, and I watched, and I said good morning. On the second day, Orion called. He calls every few days, always has, since he moved to Atlanta 6 years ago. We talked about his week, a problem at work he was working through, something he had eaten that he thought I would find funny. My voice stayed exactly as it always sounds when I talk to my son, even and warm and present. I know he noticed something. Orion has always been able to hear the things I do not say. Halfway through the call, he got quiet for a second and then asked me if Royce was there. Not how is Royce. There. I looked toward the living room before answering. I said yes. Another pause. Then Orion said all right, in a tone that told me he had heard far more than the actual conversation contained. But he did not push. He has never pushed. He asked me once, before the wedding, whether I was certain about Royce, and when I told him I was, he let it go completely. That is the kind of man I raised. He respects me enough to trust my silence, even when it troubles him. I told him nothing. Not yet. The third night, Royce slept deeply. I lay beside him until his breathing settled, and then I got up and went to the kitchen and sat in the dark at the table where I had served the dinner 2 nights before. I gave myself 1 hour, not for anger. I was not angry yet. Anger requires a kind of surprise I did not have. What I felt was grief, not for the marriage. I had already moved past the marriage in the hours since the kitchen counter. I grieved for the version of that evening I had spent weeks imagining. The dinner I had cooked for 4 hours, the candles, the good plates, the woman who had set that table believing she was beginning something. I let myself grieve her for exactly 1 hour. Then I stopped. What came in after the grief was not rage, it was clarity, the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that simply arrives and stays. I picked up my phone. I scrolled to a name I had not called in 2 years, my attorney. She answered on the 3rd ring. I said 3 words. I need you. He chose a late afternoon. I noticed that. Not the morning, when the house is busy with small tasks and exits are easy. Not the evening, when dinner provides its own natural interruptions. Late afternoon, when the light is low and the house is quiet, and there is nowhere particular to be, and no reason to leave a room quickly. He had thought about the timing. That told me something. I was reading when he came in. He sat across from me in the chair he had claimed as his since the third week of the marriage, angled toward the window, close enough to be intimate, far enough to seem respectful. He folded his hands. He looked at me with the particular softness a man produces when he has rehearsed what he is about to say and decided warmth is the right opening. He said the dinner had been on his mind. He did not name what happened at it. He said Eldwin was still adjusting, that his son had not had an easy time with change since his mother passed, and that his edges showed sometimes in ways Royce was not proud of. He said what he and I had built together over 18 months was not something he was willing to let one difficult evening diminish. He spoke slowly, carefully. The sentences landed like a man placing objects on a surface he was worried about scratching. Then he told me the way I handled myself that evening showed real grace. I looked at him. He meant it as a compliment. He was sitting in my house, in the chair he had claimed in my living room, telling me that the grace I had shown, by which he meant my silence, my stillness, my absolute refusal to react, while his son called me a fool in Spanish across my own dinner table, was something he admired in me. He was flattering me for absorbing an insult without bleeding visibly. The audacity of that framing occupied the space between us like something with its own weight. I said thank you. His shoulders loosened slightly after that. Not dramatically. Just enough for me to see how tense he had actually been before I answered. Then he made another mistake. He said he knew relationships involving finances and established lives could create anxieties for families, especially children thinking about the future. He said sometimes people reacted badly when they worried about stability changing underneath them. Stability. Not love, not respect. Stability. The words settled between us quietly. I wondered if he realized he had just confirmed the thing neither of us was naming directly. He reached across and took my hand. His thumb moved across my knuckles once, a gesture I had found reassuring when we were courting. The same gesture, the same pressure, the same pace. I did not pull away. I looked at him with the expression I had chosen for this conversation. Open enough to be readable, still enough to be unreadable. He looked back at me and found what he needed to find. I could see the exact moment he decided it was forgiveness. He was not reading me. He was reading his own relief. What I was actually thinking was this. Every word he had spoken in the last 11 minutes was going into the notebook in my bedside drawer. The framing of Eldwin as grieving and adjusting. The characterization of what happened as one difficult evening. The compliment constructed around my silence. The reference to stability and family anxiety, the hand, the thumb across the knuckles, all of it. A man managing a situation tells you exactly how he sees the situation. He had just told me everything. Then he stood and paused near the doorway before leaving, one hand against the frame, casual enough to appear spontaneous. He said maybe the two of us should finally sit down soon and talk through long-term planning properly now that the wedding was behind us. Accounts, property, making things simpler for each other. There it was again. Not romance, structure. I smiled faintly and told him we had plenty of time. That answer pleased him more than it should have. He left the room the way a man leaves a room when he believes he has handled something. Shoulders down. Step easy. I watched him go. Then I went to the bedroom, opened the drawer of my bedside table, and took out the notebook. I wrote one line. I am not going to tell you what it said. Not yet. She came alone. No Eldwin. No warning. A Tuesday afternoon with the kind of pale Birmingham sky that cannot decide between clouds and sun. I opened the door and she was standing there in a cream blouse with her hands folded in front of her and an expression arranged carefully into something that read, as troubled. For one brief second, she looked younger than I remembered, not softer, just uncertain. Then the expression settled back into place. She said she needed to come, that she had been sitting with something and could not sit with it any longer. I stepped back and let her in. I made tea the way I make tea when I am giving nothing away. Slowly, with my back to the room, letting the silence settle without filling it. She sat at the kitchen table and waited. I brought both cups and sat across from her, and I looked at her the way I look at a contract I have not signed yet. She spoke for several minutes. Her voice was warm and measured. The voice of a woman who had rehearsed not sounding rehearsed. She said what Eldwin said at the dinner table had sat badly with her from the moment she heard it. She said she almost came the next morning and then decided it might make things worse. She said she had not been able to look at herself clearly without coming here first. That detail interested me. People telling the truth usually include the part where they hesitated. She said she did not share Eldwin's thinking, not about me, not about the marriage, not about any of it. And for a moment I almost believed some part of that was sincere. Not because she was a particularly good liar, because there was something genuinely uncomfortable in the way she said Royce's name. Then she asked whether Royce knew how hurt I was. The question landed quietly. Too quietly. I looked at her over my cup and realized something important in that moment. She was not here just to apologize. She was here to measure damage. I answered carefully. I told her Royce and I were handling things privately and left it there. Her eyes sharpened for half a second before softening again. That was the first real thing she showed me. She reached across the table and briefly touched the back of my hand. Her eyes were steady when she did it. That was the second thing. When she finished, I did not respond immediately. I let a breath pass. Then I gave her one slow nod. Not warm, not cold. The kind of nod that sits in the middle of every possible interpretations and stays there. The kind that allows the other person to take from it whatever they came prepared to receive. She received it as relief. I watched her receive it. Then she made a mistake. Small. Fast. The kind people make when their mind moves ahead of their caution. She mentioned the East Side property. Only briefly. Barely a sentence. Something about Eldwin always talking about development plans over there and how stressful things had apparently become recently. She said it lightly, like someone referencing information everybody already knew. Then she stopped talking. Too late, because Royce had never once mentioned financial stress to me. Not once. I kept my face still and reached for my tea. Something shifted in her then. Not panic. Calculation correcting itself. She had come into this kitchen believing she understood the landscape better than she actually did. I saw the exact moment she realized she might have revealed too much. We talked for another 20 minutes about nothing that mattered. She finished her tea. She told me she was glad she came. She touched my hand again at the door. Lighter this time, briefer, and then she walked to her car. Before she got in, she checked her phone immediately. Not casually, expectantly. I watched her type something before she drove away. That interested me more than the apology had. I stood with my hand on the door handle for a moment after she left. I was not moved. I was not suspicious in the sharp way that produces mistakes. I was simply paying attention. The way I pay attention to any new variable in a situation I am already managing. She had shown me something today. Not what she intended to show me. Something underneath it. I did not know yet what Narissa was, but I knew she was something. I went to the bedroom. I opened the notebook. I wrote her name, the date, and one sentence beneath it. Knows more than she should. Then I closed it. I had been watching Eldwin since the wedding, not obviously. Not in any way he would have felt. But I had spent 22 years in procurement, which is, at its core, the business of noticing patterns before they become problems. When Eldwin came to the house, I noted which rooms he moved through. what he picked up and set down, which questions he asked his father, and which ones he swallowed before they reached his mouth. I had been collecting data without labeling it, the way I always collect data in the early stages of something I do not yet fully understand. 3 days after Narissa's visit, he came by on a Wednesday afternoon. I heard him come in. I was in the hallway when Royce steered him toward the back room, the small sitting room off the kitchen that Royce had begun using as his own space, in a way I had also noted and not yet addressed. The door did not close fully. I do not believe either of them registered that. I stood in the hall and I listened. Eldwin's voice was low and tight in the way a voice gets when the words inside it have been rehearsed too many times and are starting to lose their patience. He was asking about a property, the Holleran property, he called it, the commercial parcel on the east side of Birmingham. He wanted to know about the timeline, when things would be formalized, when he could expect movement. Royce's response was smooth, measured. He said these things took time. He said nothing had changed. He said Eldwin needed to trust him the way he had always trusted him. Eldwin said he needed more than that. There was a pause. Then one of them registered the silence from the hallway, and the conversation shifted into something lighter and inconsequential, the way conversations do when a room suddenly remembers it might not be empty. I moved back toward the kitchen before either of them appeared. I stood at the counter and I let the picture assemble itself. The commercial parcel on the east side. A property Royce had mentioned to me once during the courtship, briefly, in passing, as an asset he had been holding for years. He described it as fully his. Unencumbered. He used that word. I had filed it without examining it because at the time I had no reason to examine it. I had every reason now. Eldwin had been counting on that parcel, not in some distant hypothetical way, in the specific, impatient way of a man who has already spent money he has not yet received. The remarriage had not angered him because he disliked me. It had frightened him because a marriage changes the legal architecture around an asset. A wife is not a stranger. A wife has standing that a son's expectation does not automatically override. He had sat at my dinner table and called me a fool because he needed me to be one. He needed me ignorant and unbothered and gone before I understood what I had walked into. That was the fear underneath the contempt. I could see it cleanly now. It did not make me sympathetic. He had said what he said, and Royce had laughed, and those two facts lived in me unchanged. But the full picture made me precise in a way that emotion alone never could. I knew what I was protecting. I knew what he had been counting on taking. I went to the notebook. Beneath Narissa's name, I wrote the property description and a single question mark. I would have an answer by the end of the week. Her name is not important to this story. What is important is that she has known me since before Orion sat his college entrance exams, and in 19 years, she has never once told me what I wanted to hear when what I needed to hear was something different. Her office is on the south side of Birmingham, 3rd floor, the kind of building that does not announce itself. No marble lobby, no oversized signage, just clean hallways, and the particular quiet of a place where serious work gets done. I have been walking into it since before I fully understood how much I would need it. She was at her desk when I came in. She looked at me the way she always looks at me when I arrive without a scheduled appointment. Not surprised, not alarmed, just present. She closed what she was working on and folded her hands, and I sat down and I talked. I told her everything. The dinner, what was said, and in which language and by whom. Royce's visit, 4 days later, and the specific words he chose. Eldwin, adjusting. One difficult evening. Real grace. Narissa's appearance on a Tuesday 11 days after the incident and what the timing of that visit told me about its purpose. The conversation I was not meant to hear between Eldwin and Royce. The property on the east side. The word unencumbered used during a courtship conversation I now understood differently. She listened without interrupting for a long time. I have always valued that about her. She does not perform concern. She absorbs information. When I finished, she asked me one question. Not about the dinner, not about Eldwin or Narissa or the property. She looked at me steadily and asked what I wanted the outcome to be. Not how I felt, not what I deserved. The outcome, practical, legal, specific. I told her without hesitating. Then she opened the prenuptial agreement. What came next did not surprise me as much as it clarified things already sitting half-formed in the back of my mind. 3 weeks before the wedding, after Royce asked Orion whether the house was paid off, and after 2 smaller moments I could not fully explain even to myself at the time, I called her and asked for something discreet. Not an investigation, a verification, public record review, asset confirmation, the kind of preliminary diligence financially established people sometimes do before a marriage, even when they hope they will find nothing concerning. I had hoped I would find nothing concerning. She had already started pulling together what was publicly available on Royce Holleran's financial position. The properties he represented as fully owned. 2 of them carried encumbrances he had not disclosed. One had an active commercial lien. Another had unresolved title complications attached to a family inheritance matter that had never been fully settled. The income figures he presented during our courtship, structured to read as ongoing revenue what was in fact a diminishing asset position. Liquidation presented as stability. The stability he had shown me across 18 months had been maintained precisely long enough to get through a ceremony. She used a specific legal phrase for what the documented gap between his representations and his reality constituted. I am not going to use legal language here. What it meant in plain terms was this. He had told me things that were not true in order to get me to marry him, and the law had something to say about that. She explained 2 paths. A standard dissolution, which would be slower and leave certain questions open longer, and a second path, faster, cleaner, and given the documentation, well-grounded, that would challenge the validity of the marriage itself based on material financial misrepresentation. I listened to both. I asked what could realistically be proven versus merely suspected. She answered that question carefully. That mattered to me more than confidence would have. Then I told her I needed a few days. She told me the prenuptial agreement protected everything in the meantime. I already knew that. I had always known that. I drove home feeling not lighter, but more grounded. The weight was in the right hands now. I turned onto my street and pulled up to the house. Orion was standing on the front step, a paper coffee cup in his hand. 4 hours from Atlanta without calling. He was looking at my car with the expression of a man who had been rehearsing something the entire drive. I did not ask him how long he had been standing there. I took his coffee cup, still half full and cold, set it on the counter, and put the kettle on. He came inside without being asked, and sat at the kitchen table in the chair he has sat in since he was 11 years old. Some things do not require instruction. I made coffee I did not need, and he watched me make it, and neither of us said anything for a long stretch that had its own particular texture. Not uncomfortable. The silence of 2 people who have known each other long enough to let a room breathe before they ask it to carry something. He spoke first. He did not ask about Royce. He did not ask about the marriage or the dinner or any of the specific things I had not told him. He looked at me across the kitchen table and asked if I was all right. I considered it. Not how to deflect it. I was past deflection with Orion, but how to answer it honestly without handing him something he would feel obligated to act on before I was ready for action. I told him I was handling it. He asked what that meant. I told him enough. Not everything. Not the attorney's office or the 2 paths or the notebook with 3 entries in it. Enough for him to understand that I was not in crisis, that the ground beneath me was not shifting, that I had already made the calls that needed making and I was waiting on my next move with intention and not with fear. His jaw tightened once. A small movement. I know my son's face the way I know my own handwriting. He said he wanted to come down here and have a conversation with Royce. I told him no, clearly and without softening it. This was mine. Every part of it. The problem and the solution and the timing of the solution. What I needed from him was not his intervention. Not yet. He looked at me for a moment and then nodded once and let it go. That is the kind of man he is. Then he told me something he had been holding since before the wedding. He said he had never fully trusted Royce. Not for any reason he could have named cleanly at the time. It was something he noticed the first evening Royce came to this house. The way Royce's eyes moved through the rooms before he had greeted everyone in them, not admiring them, assessing them. The way a man looks at something he is calculating the value of rather than the weight of. Then Orion said something else. The night before the wedding, Royce had asked him whether the house was fully paid off, not casually, specifically. Orion told me he remembered the question because Royce asked it immediately after complimenting the backyard renovations. Too quickly. Like the thought had already been waiting in him. I stayed very still when he told me that. Royce had never asked me that question directly, which meant he had already known better than to. Orion said at the time he convinced himself it meant nothing. Weddings make people curious about finances and futures and practical things. But after the dinner, the question came back differently. Everything was coming back differently now. A floorboard shifted upstairs. Both of us looked toward the ceiling automatically. Royce. Home earlier than expected. I watched Orion's expression close immediately. Not fear, not hesitation. Restraint. The same restraint I had been practicing for days now. That nearly broke my heart more than the insult itself. My son had walked into this house ready for war and was choosing discipline because I asked him to. Royce called down from upstairs asking whether Orion had arrived. His voice sounded easy, normal, practiced. I answered yes in the same tone. Then I looked back at my son across the table. 34 years old. 4 hours of driving without calling because he needed to see my face with his own eyes. I let him see it then. Not the managed version I had been showing Royce for 2 weeks, but the actual one. The one that was tired and clear and completely certain about what came next. Something settled between us that did not need to be named. He stayed the night. In the morning, I walked him to the door and he stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back. "Whatever you need from me," he said. "Just say it." I nodded. I already knew what I would need him for, but not yet. 3 days after Orion left, I was in the kitchen when Royce came in and sat down. He had his reading glasses on and a small stack of papers in front of him. The particular arrangement of a man who wants a conversation to look spontaneous, but has been preparing it for longer than he will admit. He set his glasses on the table and looked up at me in the way he looks up when he wants something, and has decided warmth is the most efficient path to it. He said he had been thinking about something and wanted to talk it through with me. I sat down. I folded my hands on the table. I gave him my full attention, the same quality of attention I give to any situation I need to understand completely before I respond to it. He talked about partnership, about 2 people building a life together rather than running 2 separate lives on parallel tracks. He said he had been thinking about how they did things in the early years of a marriage, how the strongest foundations were built when people stopped thinking in terms of mine and yours and started thinking in terms of ours. He was warm about it, unhurried. The framing was good. It might have worked on a woman who had not already spent 3 weeks building a different kind of structure entirely. Then he named the accounts. He walked through them the way a man walks through a list he has memorized, casually, as though the specific names were incidental. A checking account. 2 investment accounts. A property-linked savings vehicle I had established 11 years ago and contributed to every quarter since. Then he mentioned estate simplification, not directly at first. He said marriages became unnecessarily complicated when people held too many things separately, that he had seen families torn apart after deaths because assets had not been streamlined properly. He mentioned survivorship protections, ease, shared planning, the language of a man attempting to make acquisitions sound responsible. Every account he named was covered by the prenuptial agreement. Every single one. I looked at him while he spoke, and I turned the situation over carefully. Either he had not read the prenuptial agreement with sufficient attention, which meant he had signed a document governing his marriage without understanding it, which told me one thing about him. Or he had read it, understood it, and was testing whether I knew what it covered, which told me something else entirely. Both possibilities landed in the same place. A man who had come into this marriage with a specific destination in mind and was now attempting to reach it through the language of love and partnership and protecting each other. Then he said something else, small, casual. He asked whether I had ever considered consolidating the Birmingham property under joint survivorship structure for simplicity. The house, my house. He said it gently enough that another woman might have mistaken it for future planning. I did not, because people protecting love do not move this carefully around ownership language. People protecting strategy do. He finished. He looked at me. He was waiting for the door to open. I told him it was worth thinking through carefully, that I wanted to make sure we approached it correctly, the right way, properly, without rushing something that deserved to be done well. I said, I appreciated him bringing it to me directly. His shoulders lowered slightly after that. Relief. Not emotional relief. Procedural relief. He nodded. He put his glasses back on. He picked up his papers. The conversation had gone the way he needed it to go, and he filed it accordingly. He should not have filed it that way. I helped with dinner. I sat across from him at the table I had set 4 weeks ago for a family dinner I had believed in completely. I passed him what he needed when he needed it. I was pleasant and present and entirely elsewhere. After dinner, I told him I needed some air. I drove 2 streets from the house and parked beneath a streetlight that flickered every few seconds without fully going out. I sat in the dark with both hands on the steering wheel and let the silence settle around me. Not grief this time. Certainty. Because men do not accidentally rehearse conversations about survivorship structures and protected accounts. He had finally stopped circling the thing he came for. I picked up my phone and called my attorney. She answered on the second ring. I said, 1 sentence. We are ready. Wednesday morning came in quietly. Light through the kitchen windows the way it comes in October in Birmingham, pale and even, without drama. Coffee already made, the house moving at its ordinary pace, Royce at the counter with his cup. Eldwin had arrived early, something about paperwork his father had set aside for him. They were in the back room when I came downstairs. I had been awake since 4. Not from anxiety. I had slept cleanly for the first time in 2 weeks and woken at 4 with the particular alertness of a person whose body knows that today is the day something moves. I had lain there for a while, and then I had gotten up and dressed carefully, not differently than usual, not better, just carefully, and come downstairs and made the coffee. and waited for the house to arrange itself the way I needed it to. I went to my bag and I took out 3 documents. The first was my copy of the prenuptial agreement, tabbed at 4 sections with the precise colored markers my attorney uses. The kind of tabbing that tells a person immediately that someone who understands the document has been through it with intention. The second was a single page my attorney had prepared. A clean summary of my full independent asset position, every account, every property, every investment vehicle, each item listed with its protected status noted beside it. 1 page, unambiguous. The third was a formal notice from my attorney's office. It did not reference the dinner. It did not reference Spanish or Eldwin or laughter or any of the events of the past 2 weeks. It was precise and formal and stated one thing clearly: that Royce Holleran's wife was represented by legal counsel in all matters relating to the marriage and its assets, that the prenuptial agreement protections were in full effect as referenced by section, and that her attorney would be in touch regarding next steps. It closed there. No elaboration, no threat, no speech. The notice gave him nothing to push against procedurally. That was the point. I carried all 3 to the dining room table. I set them down in the center, not fanned out, not stacked carelessly, but placed, the way you place something you have thought about. I straightened the edge of the top document once. Then I went to the garden. I had made tea before I came downstairs. A second cup I had been saving. I brought it out and sat in the chair that faces the back of the house, and I set the cup on the small table beside me, and I looked at the garden the way I look at it on any ordinary morning. The air was cool. The kind of Birmingham morning that has not decided yet whether it belongs to summer or to something else. I sat. It took 11 minutes. I know because I was not watching the time, and then I looked at my watch and 11 minutes had passed, and in that same moment the quality of sound inside the house changed. It went very quiet first. The particular quiet of a room in which someone has just understood something. Then Eldwin's voice, one sharp word I will not repeat here. Then Royce, lower, controlled. The voice of a man trying to manage a situation he has just realized he does not have the tools to manage. Then nothing. I lifted my tea. It was still warm. I drank it and looked at the garden, and I did not go inside. He did not come to me immediately. I stayed in the garden for another 40 minutes after the house went quiet. Long enough for the morning to fully arrive. Long enough for Royce to read what was on that table, set it down, pick it up again, and understand that what he was holding was not the opening of a negotiation. It was the close of one. I heard Eldwin before I saw anything. His voice through the back window, sharp, compressed, the sound of a man who needs something to happen and cannot make it happen. I heard Royce's voice beneath his, low and firm, cutting across whatever Eldwin was building toward. I could not make out the words. I did not need to. The shape of the exchange was clear enough. A son wanting to move, a father stopping him. Not out of protection for me, out of calculation for himself. Eldwin making a scene in my house on a Wednesday morning was material Royce could not afford to generate. Then something hit the kitchen counter hard enough for me to hear it through the glass. Silence followed immediately after. That interested me, because silence that arrives that fast usually means somebody realized they lost control for 1 second too long. Royce came to the garden 20 minutes later. He sat across from me in the other chair, the one that had been there since before he arrived in my life, and would be there after. He did not bring warmth this time. He did not bring flattery. He brought carefulness. The specific carefulness of a man trying to read a situation he no longer has a clear map for. He asked me what I wanted, not defensively, not aggressively, strategically. He framed it gently. 2 people who had built something together. Two people who owed each other a conversation before things moved in a direction neither of them wanted. His voice was measured. His hands were still. I let him speak all the way through. Then I told him I appreciated him coming to talk. I asked him if he would like some tea. He looked at me for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger, not relief. Recalibration. He was trying to find the edge of what I knew, and I was not giving him one to find. He said he did not want tea. Then he tried something else. He said attorneys complicated situations that could sometimes still be resolved privately if people remembered they cared about each other first. There it was. Not yet a direct request, but moving toward one. I said nothing. He stayed for 4 more minutes and left with nothing. Not reassurance, not ammunition. Nothing. He went back inside, and within 2 minutes I heard his voice through the kitchen window. Low, continuous. The particular register of a man on a phone call he does not want overheard. I did not move from my chair. My attorney had told me 3 days ago that this call would come. She had already prepared for what it would produce. That evening, my phone showed a message from Narissa, warm in its opening, careful in its construction. She had heard something, I did not need to imagine from whom, and she was performing the role of a concerned woman who was thinking of me. I read it twice. I set the phone face down on the table. Royce found me in the hallway before I went to bed. This time, he abandoned the soft framing entirely. He said he felt they had both been holding things back, that they owed it to what they had built to sit down together, without attorneys, without documents, and talk the way 2 adults who cared about each other should be able to talk. There it was now. Direct. He was asking me to step outside the legal process. I looked at him in the hallway of my house, and I understood that a man who had believed himself to be the architect of this situation had just shown me the full dimensions of his panic. That request was not a gesture of good faith. It was the last move of someone who had run out of better ones. I told him I needed to get some rest. I went to my room. I closed the door quietly behind me. I picked up my phone and looked at it for a long moment before typing 4 words to Orion. It is time. Come. I was at the kitchen table before 5. Royce was asleep. The house was the particular kind of quiet that belongs only to early morning. No traffic yet, no birds, just the low hum of a refrigerator and the sound of my own breathing. I had made 1 cup of coffee and set the documents my attorney sent over the evening before in a neat stack in front of me. I opened the first page and I began to read. I am going to tell you what was in those pages, not as a list, as what it actually was, which was a slow and clarifying devastation moving through me 1 paragraph at a time. The first property Royce described as fully owned during our courtship, a residential holding he mentioned twice, once in passing and once directly, carried a commercial lien filed in 2019, a business debt from a partnership that dissolved badly and was never resolved. The lien was active. The property was not free. He had used the word unencumbered about his assets in a conversation I could now date to 13 months before our wedding. The second property had a title complication he had not disclosed. A co-ownership arrangement with a sibling, an inheritance split from years back that had never been legally finalized. The title was not clean. It had not been clean when he described it to me as an asset. The income he presented across 18 months of courtship, steady, substantial, the kind that belongs to a man who has built something durable, was structured to read that way. What it actually reflected was a diminishing asset sale. Revenue from something being liquidated, presented as the yield of something thriving. The difference between those 2 things is not small. It is the difference between a foundation and a performance of one. I turned each page slowly. I thought about a dinner we had in April of last year, a restaurant he chose on the South Side. Good food, candlelight, and Royce talking about the next decade. What he wanted to build, where he wanted to be, the kind of future that required a partner who understood what stability looked like. I had listened and felt something settle in me. I thought about a morning he made me breakfast in my own kitchen and told me I had nothing to worry about for the rest of my life. I let each memory move through the new information, the way you pull a thread through fabric and watch the shape of it change. The courtship did not disappear. It clarified. Every warm evening and steady conversation and unhurried gesture now had its function visible beneath it. He had needed my assets to hold a position that had been quietly coming apart for years. Not a partner, a solution. Not a chapter. An exit from a problem I had never been shown. I sat with that for a measured amount of time. Then I got up and made a second cup of coffee. I was not destroyed. I was not trembling. I was clear. The specific clarity that arrives only when the final piece of a picture connects and the whole thing becomes visible at once. I had not been foolish. I had been targeted. Those are entirely different things, and I knew with complete certainty which one I was. I picked up my phone and I called my attorney. When she answered, I told her I had made my decision. I named the option, the faster path, the cleaner one. She told me what the next step required. I told her to proceed. My attorney sent the title history on a Thursday morning. I read it at my desk in the small office off the hallway. The room I had used for 22 years to run my business. The room Royce had never once asked to enter, which I now understood was either indifference or instinct. The commercial parcel on the east side of Birmingham. The property Eldwin had asked his father about in that back room, with a voice tight enough to tell me everything about how long he had been counting on it. I read the title history twice. The parcel Royce had described as wholly his, unencumbered, clean, an asset he had held for years, with the quiet confidence of a man who knew what he owned. Carried the same 2019 commercial line I had found on his personal financial record. Filed against the property directly. Active and unresolved. A debt that had been sitting on that title for 5 years, while Royce spoke about his assets, the way a man speaks about things he has every right to offer. Below the lien sat a dormant co-ownership claim. A sibling Royce had never mentioned to me, not once across 18 months of courtship and conversation, arising from an inheritance division that had never been legally completed. The title was not clean. It had not been clean when Eldwin began building his expectations around it, and it had not been clean when Royce let him build them. Then I reached the final attachments my attorney included, a pending notice from the lien holder's attorneys. Recent, 3 weeks old. Formal demand language regarding non-payment and possible enforcement action if the debt remained unresolved. And beneath that, something newer. A refinancing denial. The lender had declined extension negotiations less than 2 weeks before my wedding. The property no longer met the conditions required to restructure the debt exposure. A balloon payment deadline sat highlighted in the correspondence like something quietly counting down in the background, while Royce stood beside me, discussing flower arrangements and honeymoon plans. I read that page more slowly than the others. Royce had married me while that deadline was already closing in around him. Not years ago, not before he met me. While we were choosing flowers and discussing guest lists and standing in my kitchen talking about the future in soft voices over coffee. I set the papers down carefully. I thought about Eldwin at that dinner table. The casual confidence of a man speaking in a language he was certain I did not share. She is a fool. He had believed that completely, not because he was cruel by nature, though cruelty had found him easily enough, but because he had been sold a future that required me to remain ignorant long enough for everybody else's math to keep working. He had directed every ounce of his fear at the wrong person. I had not created his situation. I had arrived at the precise moment it was already collapsing under the weight of what his father had hidden from him. My presence had not ruined his inheritance. It had interrupted a performance before the final act could close around me. That realization settled something in me. Not sympathy. Never that. He had sat at my table and called me a fool while his father laughed beside him. Those facts remained exactly where they belonged. But now I understood the architecture of the entire thing. Who built it? Who benefited from it? Who had been manipulated by it? And who thought they were the only ones capable of strategy? I heard a car outside late that afternoon. Royce moved toward the front door so quickly I noticed it immediately. I stepped into the hallway and looked through the side window. Eldwin stood on the porch, holding papers in one hand. Royce kept his voice low, one hand slightly raised, calming, containing. Eldwin said something sharp enough that Royce looked toward the street before answering him. Then Eldwin lifted the papers between them. Even from the hallway, I recognized the formatting. Legal correspondence? His face changed while Royce spoke. Not anger this time. Something worse. The expression of a man realizing the future he had been defending never actually existed in the form he was promised. Royce reached for his arm. Eldwin stepped back. That was the moment I understood something important. The first real crack between them had nothing to do with me. It was money. I stepped away from the window before either of them could look toward the house. I had not gone there for satisfaction. I had gone because I needed to see the truth moving without my hands on it. My phone lit up on the desk behind me. Orion, on the road, 2 hours out. He arrived in the early evening. I heard his car in the drive, and I did not go to the door immediately. I finished what I was doing at my desk, a single email to my attorney confirming a document she needed. And then I went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. By the time he knocked, I was ready. He came in and looked at me the way he had looked at me from the front step 8 days ago. Checking, measuring, making sure. I let him look. I put a cup in front of him and sat across from him, and I told him everything. From the beginning. The dinner. What was said, and in which language, and by whom. Royce's visit 4 days later and the specific words he chose. Nerissa on a Tuesday. The overheard conversation about the property. The attorney's office and what the documents showed. The table. The garden. The hallway. The night Royce asked me to remove the attorneys. The title. History. Where things stood now. I spoke for a long time. He did not interrupt once. When I finished, he sat with it for a moment. Then he asked me 2 questions. The first was whether I was safe. I told him yes, completely and in every sense he meant. The second was whether I needed anything from him right now. I told him yes, to sit where he was and let me finish. He almost smiled. He sat back. He folded his hands on the table and let me lead. Then I told him about Nerissa. 3 days after the table drop, Royce's attorney attempted something procedural, not aggressive, careful. A proposed pause before formal filings moved forward. Informal discussion language, quiet resolution framing. Enough confidence in the wording to tell my attorney they believed I was still emotionally undecided and more concerned with discretion than escalation. That confidence interested her immediately because it did not come from anything she had disclosed. Then came the second communication. More specific this time. It referenced my supposed desire to avoid embarrassment and preserve the appearance of the marriage if possible. It suggested I might respond well to private negotiation around asset separation if approached gently enough. None of that came from me. None of it came from my attorney. It came from somebody interpreting me, and interpreting me incorrectly. Narissa had gone to Royce's attorney directly, not through Eldwin, on her own initiative, in her own interest. She had taken what she gathered from her Tuesday visit, that I had an attorney, that the prenuptial agreement was active, that I appeared calm, measured, possibly interested in quiet resolution, and she had packaged it as intelligence, insider access, something useful, something valuable enough to buy herself standing in a situation she realized was shifting beneath her. What she handed them created just enough false confidence to slow their response by several days. That mattered. Because while Royce's attorney believed I was weighing emotional reconciliation privately, my attorney was already preparing filings and securing documentation they should have moved to contain much earlier. Narissa had not helped Royce. She had delayed him, and she never realized it. On that Tuesday, I had given her one nod and a cup of tea, and words selected entirely for what they would not reveal. She left my kitchen believing she understood me because she mistook stillness for uncertainty. A great many people make that mistake. Everything she passed along showed Royce's side only what I had chosen to show. Enough calm to make them comfortable, enough restraint to encourage overconfidence, and absolutely nothing useful. She had tried to become indispensable to a situation she did not understand. Instead, she became a liability to one side and irrelevant to the other. I was not angry with her. Anger would have required surprise. I had known from Tuesday what she was. A woman trying to secure her position before the structure around her shifted completely. I almost respected the instinct. Almost. Orion sat quietly for a long moment after I finished. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at me differently than he had when he walked through the door. Not worried now. Seeing me clearly. Then he asked what happens next. I looked at my son across the kitchen table in the house I had owned for 26 years, and I told him. The annulment proceedings moved faster than Royce's attorney anticipated. Not instantly, not magically. There were filings, responses, temporary hearings, documentation requests, weeks of controlled procedural movement that ended exactly where my attorney said they would. The preliminary findings favored my position early enough that most of the remaining process became containment rather than contest. That is the thing about documented misrepresentation. When the record is clean and the evidence is specific, and the attorney on your side has been preparing since before you walked into a garden with a cup of tea, there is not much procedural room left for the other side to occupy. The prenuptial agreement held completely throughout the proceedings. It was never in meaningful jeopardy. Every account, every property, every investment vehicle I had built across 22 years of work, untouched. Royce's attorney made one attempt at a negotiated settlement. The language they chose was dignified. Two people finding a quiet resolution, mutual respect, a clean conclusion. My attorney responded in writing, 3 sentences. I do not know exactly what those 3 sentences said. I know they were sufficient because there was no second attempt. 2 days later, Royce knocked on my office door. Not the bedroom, not the kitchen. The office. The one room in the house he had avoided since the wedding. I looked up from my desk and told him to come in. He stood just inside the doorway for a moment before speaking. No rehearsed warmth this time. No soft eyes. No language about partnership or grace or building a future together. Just a tired-looking man standing in a room he now understood had never belonged to him. He said he had made mistakes. I let the silence sit where it landed. Then he said something that finally told the truth without meaning to. He said he thought we could help each other. Not love, not marriage. Help. There it was. The entire thing reduced to one honest sentence that arrived too late to matter. He looked around the office once while he spoke. The shelves, the files, the framed certifications. 22 years of work arranged quietly around him. I watched him understand, in real time, that none of it had ever needed him. That was the first truly honest moment of our marriage. Then he asked if there was any way to keep things from becoming part of the public record. Not because he wanted us back, because he wanted containment. The lien complications, the refinancing denial, the title dispute. Once formal proceedings referenced those documents, they became visible in the way legal matters become visible to lenders, attorneys, business associates, and anyone else with reason to look closely enough. I told him no. He nodded slowly after that, like a man finally running out of places to stand. Royce left the house on a Tuesday. Not dramatically. He packed what was his, which was less than he arrived believing it would become, and he left. I was in my office when he carried the last box out. I heard the front door close. Then, unexpectedly, I heard it open again. His footsteps stopped outside the office. For a moment, I thought he might say something meaningful, something angry, something honest enough to hurt. Instead, he said he had loved me in his own way. I almost answered. Then I realized a man who truly loved you does not laugh while someone humiliates you at your own table. I said nothing. A few seconds later, I heard the door close for the last time. Nerissa. I did not need to address directly because the truth addressed her without my assistance. As the property complications entered the legal record through the proceedings, the inheritance she quietly positioned herself beside stopped looking like security and started looking like exposure. I had not engineered that outcome for her. I had simply moved in the direction of the truth. The truth has its own accounting system. Orion stayed 4 days. On the last evening, I made food. Nothing elaborate. The kind of meal that belongs to a kitchen that has been a home for a long time. At some point, he looked at me across the table and said he understood now. Not just what happened. Who I had always been. A woman who knew exactly when to be still and exactly when to move. I put another piece of chicken onto his plate and told him to eat while it was hot. Now it is just me and this house and everything in it that I built before Royce Holleran arrived and everything that continued after he left. Sometimes I think about that dinner table, the candles, the good plates, a man speaking in a language he was certain I did not understand, my husband laughing quietly beside him. I almost smile when I think about it now. I was never the fool in that room. I was the only one who knew it.